Hello, and welcome to another episode of Chatter, a podcast from The Gist. On today's show, we talked to Sorcha Eastwood, the Alliance Brexit advisor. We had a really fun chat. We got into what's going on at Stormont, the Irish border, Brexit, Theresa May, the DUP dark money scandal. Before we start, quick announcement, we are now on Spotify, so if you get your podcast there, you can find us there, or maybe you already have. You can subscribe to us on iTunes. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter as well to keep up to date with everything we're doing. So let's get on with it. Here's Sorcha Eastwood. So, Sorcha, welcome to the podcast. It's lovely to have you here to chat to us. It's been a mad couple of weeks. We've had endless numbers of resignations. There was checkers, but we're here at Stormont. So I want to start with, why haven't we got a government at Stormont? Why haven't we had one for over 500 days?
Yeah, there's a lot to cover in that question. I think basically where we are at the minute is an impasse. What Alliance have said from the start is that we had said last year, after the Assembly election in March 2017, we had then called for an independent person to come in and chair the talks to facilitate almost in some way us moving forward. And what we saw essentially from the back end of March to the end of June was essentially a very unstructured approach. There wasn't a set kind of agenda in terms of, right, this is the day we're going to meet and this is what we're going to talk about and this is on the agenda and, you know, these are the big issues that we want to talk about and get over the line. There wasn't that structured approach at all. For us, that was something that was hugely problematic and I think ultimately has, you know, helped in some ways to fuel the stalemate, if you like. We needed somebody to come in and say, look, this is the problem. This is what we need to talk about and overcome it. And unfortunately, the Secretary of State and the UK government weren't prepared to do that at that point. We know where we are now, 500 plus days without a government. I think we've almost beaten Belgium now for the length of time that a country hasn't formed an administration.
I think we hold the record for no government.
Oh, well, there we go then. we're unfortunately the poor record holders of that.
I think the record was from sort of early 2000s, but we're approaching the Northern Ireland record.
You know, the thing is, the longer this continues, the longer people are going to suffer. And in some ways, people talk about this as if it's a huge, you know, abstract issue. The fact that there's a building and people are meant to work there and, you know, they're still getting paid, but nothing's getting done. £9 million so far. Yeah, I know. It's terrible. But really, this comes down to people and there are working families who are struggling. The price of a lot of consumer goods is going up. We've already seen impact on currency fluctuations through Brexit. Working families are suffering. And the longer this goes on, the longer people will have to suffer. I mean, for example, we've seen an issue with Dunmurry Manor Care Home. Had there been a minister in place, there could have been, you know, additional actions taken. We would have seen all the Assembly members in the chamber having a debate about it. That would have probably led to some actions coming out of the department. And I mean, take, for example, the policing board. You know, the Secretary of State is now taking steps to address the issue, but, you know, where was that action when it was actually needed? You know, it is essential that we have accountability over policing. It's such a crucial thing. I mean, it's just a staple of any country. So the fact that issues like that are being missed, we've also had a situation develop within education where we are constantly funding an ineffective and inefficient model through segregated schooling, where schools are having to close, parents are having to buy books for their kids because we're hearing that schools are struggling with finance. And we're still in a position where we have absolutely no assembly to discuss that and no minister to take decisions. So the longer it goes on, the more problematic it will be, and ultimately it's affecting the people.
So do you think the lack of structure was out of carelessness? Do you think it was a more concerted effort to try to ensure that no government was formed? or perhaps because they didn't want to rock the boat for the people who were propping their government up. But this did technically take place before the confidence to supply agreement. Or do you think there's just sort of been an attitude of apathy that's kind of indicative of the way that the British government are looking at Northern Ireland these days?
If you look at the timetable of events, so back end of 2016, RHI, it was clear that things were starting to deteriorate then. And, people were starting to talk about the possibility institutions falling. Then obviously January 17, that was us plunged into yet another election. Only 6-7 months prior to the last one. So from January to the March, whenever the campaign was done, if you look over at Westminster, for example, their bandwidth was completely and utterly taken up with Brexit and what was going on there and what was happening over there. Then in March, whenever we had the election, we got the results. Various parties were given a mandate. It was decided then that the talks should start. Once it became clear that there was still an impasse. And in the period from March to June, when the Westminster election happened, on the 8th of June, I won't forget because that was my wedding day and I was a candidate. If you look at that period, you can see that, yes, you're quite right in the assertion that there was the school of thought, would the UK government been better not to call an election in the middle of the talks, because it seemed to be this period from March to the April building up that we were going to have a solution here for Northern Ireland, that people had reached some sort of a consensus. And there was a real feeling that, look, if we push a bit harder, we can get this over the line. We can maybe, work through these issues. To call a general election in the middle of that progress, to me, it wasn't a wise move. Ultimately, in the end, it didn't pay off for the Conservatives either. May has ruled the day that she called that election very foolhardy. But from a Northern Ireland perspective, which is all I'm concerned about, personally, if it had been me, I wouldn't have called it. It ran roughshod over the progress that had been made at that time. And then obviously we had the situation where May, having been so weakened by the results of that general election, that she was then forced to rely on the DUP. Then you get into the school of thought, well, are we now going to view the UK government as an honest broker if they are getting into partnership with the DUP? Yes, they're not a coalition partner as such, but obviously the confidence and supply agreement is central and it is significant, especially at a time whenever Brexit is going through the House and you're seeing votes all the time happening in the House on key parts of legislation that will ultimately impinge on the amount of action that the UK government can take in relation to Brexit. So, from our perspective, was it the wisest move to make to call that general election? No, for various reasons. Have we seen a hands-off approach from the UK government to the issue of Northern Ireland since? Yes, we have. Has that paid off? No, it hasn't. And we're in a position now where last month, June 2017, Karen Bradley had said this is going to be the end of it. This is going to be the absolute line in the sand. June 2017, if progress isn't made, we're going to have to take some action. And we had that anniversary pass last month and still nothing has moved on. So it almost became then a running joke about when's a deadline, not a deadline, when it's in the Northern Ireland talks. And, people can laugh and have a joke, but it takes me right back to the original point, which is that the longer it goes on, the more it devalues even the idea of what we're doing here. It's about democracy. It's about actually acting for the people of this place who deserve, frankly, so much better than what they've been given. And it devalues that whole process. And ultimately, this is what I say to people now. Brexit isn't an event. It's not some sort of Independence Day that Nigel Farage wants. It's not a day.
The day democracy peaked, I think is the term.
What a terrible moment. It's a process. And ultimately, when that process concludes, for better or for worse, what is going to be left for Northern Ireland? That's my point now. May decided to trigger Article 50, which threw us into a time-bound scenario. The clock ticked, and once that starts, that's your guide then. That's what you're working to. And as we know, March 2019 is approaching so rapidly, and we're still absolutely no further on. But what I do know is that April 2019, Northern Ireland's still going to be here. We still need to form a government, and the people here still need us to deliver. So my question now is, post-Brexit, what sort of scenario are we creating if the DUP are being seen to so clearly wag the tail of the dog, in what is a huge detriment to all of us here in Northern Ireland? Where does that leave us whenever Brexit's over?
This is something I was going to get into later, but is devolution dead in Northern Ireland? We've had no discernible progress forward since the agreement that the DUP walked away from last year. The DUP and Sinn Féin have spent 18 months, 2 years with two brand new leaders at each other's throats, and now they can't be seen to get into bed with the people they've spent the best part of 2 years fighting with and convincing their base they are the enemy and that they'll never work with or compromise with them. I can't really ever foresee a scenario in which we can get Stormont back up and running with Arlene Foster as leader of the DUP. Then last year we had the Citizens' Assembly proposals that was starting to get a lot of steam in January. It had £100,000 pledged to it, I believe, but doesn't really seem to have gone anywhere. The DUP seemed to have said, well, we're not really willing to consider this. Jim Wells came down and said that he felt that these sorts of decisions should be made by elected representatives, ironically, whilst the DUP were refusing to get into an executive with Sinn Féin, but I guess we can't pin everything on them. But is devolution finished for the people of Northern Ireland for the foreseeable future?
I actually think what this crisis that we're in terms of not only the Northern Ireland situation, but the wider Brexit context, which everything is in the backdrop to, has proved that Northern Ireland is a place that has showed that devolution can definitely work. If you look at, for example, my party colleague David Ford, who was the Minister of Justice, who presided over the devolution of police and justice powers, that was something that was so significant to this place, to all political views, a very significant moment in the history of Northern Ireland and the history of this place. And that proved that devolution can work. If you look at my party colleague Stephen Farry, who was former Minister for Department of Employment and Learning, who did some really fantastic work in terms of apprenticeships, creating higher level apprenticeships, and also showed that actually devolution can really work. This is going to get a bit technical, but bear with me. In GB, they passed laws that basically said if you wanted to take an employment claim against your employer for whatever reason, you had to pay for it. So essentially, you may have been done wrong in the workplace, and instead of actually having the right to go and query that at an industrial tribunal or a fair employment tribunal, you had to pay for the privilege. Over here, under the devolved assembly, whenever he was minister, he looked at it and said, actually, no, I don't think that's right on principle, but I actually don't think legally that that's right either. And we didn't adopt it. In GB, it was then found not so long ago to actually have been unlawful. So there's an example of where Northern Ireland made its own impact in a really, really strong and significant way to ordinary people here. So I don't think devolution is dead. As I'd said before, Brexit is, a process, and whatever the outcome may be, if it's going to be a hard Brexit, a soft Brexit, potentially no Brexit, Northern Ireland will still be here. I'm not going to avoid the elephant in the room, which is obviously the fact that Brexit has thrown the constitutional issue right onto the agenda again. Obviously, people are seeing that as a reason to start talking about the constitutional issue again. There are people who are very much, setting out their stall for campaigning around unification. There are people who are very much trying to set out the stall for unionism and, how it can be a vehicle for change, and people who are critiquing it as well at the same time, saying we need to see, a change in unionism where they aren't afraid to, really challenge maybe elements within that way of thinking and challenge them in the likes of equal marriage and stuff like that. But essentially, what we are still going to need to have is an assembly that delivers for the people here. Whenever I go out and speak to people, whenever I go out and do the likes of constituency work, whenever you're meeting people, up and down the street in the town or wherever, and they're asking how are things getting on, and you say, oh well, they're still no further on, the talks are now falling apart and there's actually nothing going on at this point in time. They're not asking me, so what's your view on the constitutional issue? They're asking me, is my son going to be able to get a place because actually I know that school that he wants to go to is oversubscribed, or my mummy's been in a care home and I'm really concerned about what's going on after that Dunmurry care home incident, and I want to know, is the department going to take a look at this? Do I need to worry about my elderly parents? So ultimately devolution is still very much alive and well. I don't think that devolution has failed. I think that we have failed devolution. And I think ultimately people need to have stability. You've seen in the events of the last week what happens when there is a political void. Dark actors come and attempt to fill that void themselves for their own selfish and destructive reasons. And I'm glad that there has been wholehearted condemnation right across the political spectrum for the events of the last week or so. But look, condemnation is necessary and it's needed. But ultimately what we need to do is challenge people on actually having those difficult conversations between the parties, between ourselves as a society, and actually saying, look, we need to get back together and get this working for the people.
You raise some excellent points. Like, Stormont has given us some great stuff in the past. It was fantastic to get to go to Queen's for $3,500 a year instead of $9,000 a year. So thanks, Stormont. Ultimately, people's lives go on whether Stormont's there or not. And surely the same sort of thing that we have now could be achieved with direct rule plus well-engaged local councillors.
So here's the thing. So here's what I'll put back to that in terms of challenge. If we look at direct rule, let's take Brexit. Let's take the issue of the border. Let's take the issue of complete and utter lack of understanding that we've seen from the NIO, that we've seen from the front bench of the Tory party. Nobody understands Northern Ireland quite like we do, because we're here and it's where we live and it's where we are, and we get the context, we understand it. If you're going to throw the argument out there that, well, look, what's the difference? We may as well have direct rule. You're not going to get the same approach. So if you have a Conservative Party at the minute that has openly said, over the years, over the decades on the record, that they, maybe want to have a review of, you just said tuition fees there, you're going to have, potentially a situation where you do see an increase in tuition fees. Conversely, by the same token, we have continually as a party challenged the Secretary of State and the government on the issue of equal marriage, for example. Since the institutions have fallen, and we have seen a lack of interest in wanting to act on it. We're stuck in a moment of time where we understand that we don't want the government coming in and taking unilateral action on certain issues. We need to be able to actually govern ourselves and take those issues, like, for example, equal marriage that I talked about. Clearly there's a political will across the majority of parties. There's a public will. Take, for example, the historical institutional abuse inquiry, the recommendations that were made by Judge Hart there. That was one of almost the last pieces to go through the House before the institutions fell here in Northern Ireland. Recommendations that could be adopted and acted on there. If you look at the issue of a pension for victims and survivors, which remains outstanding. If you look at the issue of reproductive rights in terms of abortion, a discussion on abortion reform, which we've seen the likes of Stella Creasy and also my party colleague, former outgoing MLA David Ford, who had sought to take action on that through the Assembly. If you look at all of those things, you can see where clearly Northern Ireland knows what needs to change, and the people of this place want to see that change, and we want to do it for ourselves. If we throw it open to that direct rule scenario, we don't know what we're going to get. And under a Conservative Party, I would really question where that would go, particularly in terms of cuts to public services, where we have had a steady diet of austerity And it's absolutely no surprise that we're seeing cuts to the likes of, for example, cross-border services at a time whenever they're needed more than ever in terms of the Brexit debate and how to actually inform that conversation. And due to a period of austerity, those sorts of things are being cut. Also to youth services as well, who have suffered really badly. So, we're a special place that is coming from a post-conflict society. And sometimes I have to query if the current Conservative government actually recognise that enough in terms of supporting the crucial outreach work that needs to be done here. I would really question their understanding of this place. And I think, if nothing else, if you take it on Brexit and look at their track record there in the last 18 months, they have proven themselves to be utterly out of touch with what the public of this place want.
Aren't essentially all of your arguments based on the fact that we've got a Conservative government in Westminster at the moment? Say, for example, if you had a Labour government and direct rule, I'm fairly certain that equal marriage would pass, that abortion rights would be extended to the people of Northern Ireland as they are in the rest of the UK. And you'd have generally a more sympathetic ear for issues of social justice. And say we get devolution back, all these issues, most of them are going to be blocked by the DUP anyway, whilst they remain the largest party in the Assembly. And I just don't see the DUP or Sinn Féin suffering electoral consequences for 500 days of no government. I would love to believe that people were going to be like, no, this is when we vote them out. They've gone too far, and everyone just go to the polls and vote Green and Alliance. It would be fantastic, but that's probably not going to happen. So would direct rule with empowered local councillors really be that bad? Like, I would much prefer we had devolution and we were able to govern ourselves, but are all your arguments not predicated on the fact that the DUP are essentially holding the confidence and supply agreement over the Conservative Party? Surely a majority Labour government or coalition with the Liberal Democrats even would see them look more kindly upon making Northern Ireland a more fair and equal place.
Yeah, you raise a good point. I mean, obviously we're dealing with the reality of where we are at the minute, which is a Conservative government propped up by the DUP. Back in the period of 97, 98, we were under a Labour government, which arguably had a different attitude towards Northern Ireland. But I'll put this out there. On Monday evening, we had various amendments go through the House, and essentially one of those amendments was crucial to Northern Ireland, and it didn't go to a division. It was done orally in the House, and if a group of MPs shout loud enough no, then that will force it to a division. There were Conservative MPs, Labour MPs, Lib Dem MPs, SNP, obviously the DUP, and others. And not one single person felt strongly enough to shout to force it to a division on a vote that is absolutely crucial to the future of Northern Ireland and how much leeway the UK government has decided to bind themselves with. So ultimately, right across the parties, nobody wanted to push to a division. Nobody wanted, essentially, in my man's terms, to shout loud enough for Northern Ireland. So I take the point that, yes, I was critiquing the current administration, but did anybody that night in the House of Commons shout loud enough for Northern Ireland?
It's quite a depressing metaphor, isn't it?
No, they didn't.
Now, you mentioned the Irish border there. Do you feel like Sinn Féin have been sitting back a little bit, sort of a little bit hands off, not pushing back on a hard Brexit or any sort of border as much as they could have been, because they're in the back of their minds thinking, well, maybe if there is a hard border, we might get our border poll, or if there's a hard Brexit, we might finally get a vote?
I think if you take it right back to June 2016, and the parties coalesced around either remain or leave prior to the referendum, and the DUP took their stance, which was to leave. I'm still really genuinely on the record. I'm really still not quite sure as to why they did that.
Well, they have been traditionally Eurosceptic. Like, it's not like it's completely out of the
and you know what I don't get? there is a large swathe of people within the farming community, for example, who would have traditionally voted DUP, and others who wouldn't have voted DUP within that same community. But there are links there, and they receive so much through CAP, Common Agricultural Policy payments, and now, I mean, because I've went out and met with them, they're absolutely disgusted at the fact that they could lose their livelihoods, their farms that they've held in their families for generations overnight because of this totally reckless vote. And I don't understand why and how the DUP reconcile that with that particular group. But they took the stance to leave anyway, and Sinn Féin and others, ourselves included, SDLP and some Ulster Unionists, took the view that we are much better within the European Union, and that's a view that we still have, that we've been strong proponents for a long time. The thing that really, for me, showed where the narrative took a turn was after the referendum, where people immediately sought to try and do what we always do here, which is view things through an orange and green lens. And you know what? People aren't going to like to hear this. But the truth is that actually there is massive cross-community support for Remain. There is absolute huge cross-community support for special arrangements for this place. And those that seek to try and push the narrative that Brexit must mean if you're unionist, you're a leaver, and if you're nationalist, you must be a Remainer, and all nationalists and all unionists will support that, and it's only nationalists that support a Remain. That's absolute bunkum. You know, it's factually incorrect. It's not true. There are many people out there from all different political persuasions, all different political opinions that are very much in favour of remaining within, or let's be honest, totally reversing Brexit, because there's no such thing as a good Brexit. Let's just make that very clear from our Alliance Party perspective.
What do you mean there's no such thing as a good Brexit?
No, there's not. You know, let's not lose sight of that. I think maybe even over in Westminster, people are now starting to realise that themselves. But look, if it needs to happen, we're certainly not going to walk into it with our eyes wide shut. We're going to try and fight our hardest for the people of Northern Ireland, and we're going to try and fight to get the best deal that we can. And the tragedy in all of this for me is that obviously we're a cross-community party, and we're seeking to represent the views of everybody in a fair and balanced way, and we make absolutely no apologies for that. And what we've seen is unionists supporting the Remain, nationalists supporting the Remain, people who have absolutely no affiliation at all supporting Remain, and this idea that it's only the preserve of one side of the community is wrong. And to be quite honest, the DUP are acting contrary to the belief of, I would say, a hugely significant proportion of this place. Northern Ireland voted to remain. We made it very clear that we don't want to leave. That's still the view. And in fact, we have now seen that figure rise to 71%, I think, of people now want to remain within Northern Ireland. So look, you know, I don't know who the DUP think they're acting for, but they're certainly not doing it for the people of Northern Ireland, and they're certainly not doing it for the economic future of this place either. So, you know, for me, the biggest thing that we need to push is that support for Remain and support for special arrangements is a cross-community issue.
Now, there's a couple of things I need to address there. First of all, I think as far as I'm aware, one of the amendments that was passed by the Brexiteers and the European Research Group means that Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK can't be separated by a customs border. Now, that's still to go to the House of Lords, and it might come back. They might just throw it out altogether. They might add their own amendments or their own backstop proposal. We really don't know what's going to happen. There's no point in speculating on it at this point. I think the figure you were looking for was the UK in a Changing Europe poll that found 69% of people in Northern Ireland would now vote to remain. I don't know how clear the statement we made at the referendum was, yes, we voted to remain as a country, but it was only 56 to 44, I believe. And if we're going to call 52 to 48 in the country as a whole a narrow majority, I don't know if you can call a couple of extra points a conclusive decision from Northern Ireland, but we did vote to remain. And I think those attitudes have been pushed further, and people have started to get worried because of the sort of lack of solution to the Irish border and the talk of, a hard border going in. I think the idea with CAP was that people who voted for Brexit were expecting the UK government to perhaps provide subsidies instead of the ones they were getting from the EU, just like a straight trade, that they wouldn't allow farmers to go under just because they weren't part of the common agricultural policy anymore. And I think the complaint from Eurosceptics was that the common agricultural policy is too top down and that it's too difficult to set a policy for 27 countries without being as region specific as you probably could be with a more locally controlled agricultural policy. Now, when you mention the DUP there, you're kind of alluding to the fact that they may well have got some very shadily supplied money in order to support Brexit quite so fervently as they did, especially considering that a hard border and a hard Brexit is probably the closest thing to economic suicide that Northern Ireland could possibly contemplate. The government's own Brexit impact assessments found that the UK as a whole would see their GDP 11% worse off compared to projections for staying within the European Union. And the region-specific ones had, I think, a worse figure for Northern Ireland, just given how reliant we are on cross-border trade. And we're slowly edging towards a no-deal Brexit and a cliff edge that could crash the economy.
Look, I think that the key thing about the amendments the other evening was that we're in a process. The EU have said, look, if you want to leave the club, fine, grand, we'll try and facilitate that. We're sorry to see you go. We're sad to see that you're leaving. But look, here's the issue. Northern Ireland is going to be the only part of the UK with a land border. Should we not be able to get to a stage that we're able to negotiate the future relationship, we're going to need to make sure that there's in some way a parachute and insurance policy for Northern Ireland to protect it if we get to the point where we can't agree the way forward. And that became to be known as the backstop. So the backstop is there. It was agreed upon in December by the UK and the EU as fundamental to the progress of the withdrawal agreement. There was an understanding of that at the time. A matter of, 48 or 72 hours later, David Davis went on TV, did a live TV interview, and basically more or less trashed it, gave the impression that perhaps, quote unquote, it wasn't worth the paper it was written on. At that time then, that forced the hand of the EU and Ireland to say, well, look, let's actually just commit this to text. Let's actually just, lock this down in black and white in writing, because this is absolutely fundamental to, us to do. That was done. In March then, there came the legal text, and the UK immediately engaged in what I can only call almost backsliding from their original agreement in December. That then fueled the feeling that there wasn't any trust between the UK and the EU. After all, they had engaged in December with them and said, yeah, look, it's not fantastic, it's not where we want to be, the backstop's like the bottom floor of this thing, but we understand that should the wheels fall off and we need something to protect Northern Ireland, fair enough, we have it in there. So what they've done themselves is undermine their own trust and undermine their own relationship between the UK and the EU in that regard. What we saw on Monday night was totally unnecessary, where the UK and the DUP immediately characterising the backstop or any customs checks in the Irish Sea as something that was divisive, as something that was taking Northern Ireland out of the United Kingdom. It doesn't. It isn't. It is there purely as an insurance policy. If it needs to kick in, what it actually does is ensures that Northern Ireland can continue to trade north-south and east-west which means that we don't sever that critical east-west trade. And it was so unnecessary. What May should have done from the start was simply agree to the need for a backstop, but concentrate so hard on getting such a good deal, this frictionless border that she said she was going to guarantee. She should have concentrated so hard on getting it that would have then made the backstop null and void. It wouldn't have been needed. Yes, it would have been there. Yes, it would have been necessary as part of the withdrawal agreement to agree to it. But then if you get that withdrawal agreement over the line, you can then work in your future relationship, which is where they want to be, these sunlit uplands where they can go and do whatever it is they want. But the point being, if they had have understood from the off, the backstop wasn't where anybody wanted to be. We don't want to be at the backstop. The Alliance Party doesn't want to be at the backstop. It's the absolute bottom floor. It is the absolute bare minimum. And it only provides for goods. In terms of the single market, it doesn't provide for full access to 4 fundamental freedoms. So it's certainly not perfect. It's certainly not something that we are saying, oh yeah, that'll do. That's absolutely not where we want to be at all. We don't want any extra barriers, across these islands. But look, we're practical people, and we understand that if that needs to be there, should the worst happen, it's going to provide some form of protection. And fundamentally, what has been missing in this is that concern by the UK government for the people of Northern Ireland. You know, you're hearing the DUP and the UK government crow about how much they care about Northern Ireland. If they did care about Northern Ireland, I would challenge them in this and say, if you did care, what you would do is simply agree to that, but work so damn hard on getting a deal that actually does deliver for Northern Ireland, that does ensure that the border remains open and frictionless, that it wouldn't have been an issue. But unfortunately, the DUP, aided and abetted by the UK government, have bought into this narrative. Somehow there's an attempt to annex Northern Ireland by the EU. That's not the case at all. They had an opportunity to prove to the people of Northern Ireland that they were serious about wanting to protect this place, serious about wanting the best for everyone here, and they blew it.
Do you think their stern opposition to the backstop kind of shows that they're preparing in a way for expect a no-deal Brexit?
Well, look, I mean, this is it. I mean, people, it's been my opinion for quite some time. And I mean, obviously, as Brexit advisor, I'm very close to the issue. It's my whole life, unfortunately, sadly, regrettably at this point. Get used to it. I know, it's not going anywhere. But look, you know, this has been my view from the start, and people have said to me, why do you now think a no-deal Brexit is close? And what I say to them is, look, this is an iterative process. Brexit is a process. We're seeing the UK government constantly engage in this trilemma where they say that they want to remove us from the customs union. They say that they want to remove us from the single market, but yet they're somehow going to have this open, frictionless border as it is today. But you can't have that if you take Northern Ireland out of the customs union and the single market. But yet they keep voting to do just that. So for a start off, that's the trilemma that the UK government are engaged in and continue to do so. But what we saw at the start of this week was an iterative process where that bill went through the House, the amendments were voted on, and each amendment chipped away at the possibility of there being that case for an open and frictionless border in Northern Ireland. And that's what we're seeing the UK government do, go through an iterative process where eventually they're taking us down a road where the only option is a no-deal Brexit. I needn't tell people how disastrous a no-deal Brexit will be for Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom and Ireland. You know, it doesn't suit anybody. It works for nobody. And ultimately, it is totally farcical. You have had people from the business community say very strongly that a no-deal Brexit isn't going to work for them. The tariffs under WTO are going to be extortionate. You're going to have small businesses, SMEs, for example, that are going to be almost wiped out overnight because they're not going to be able to cope with the costs. You've heard about electricity barges in the Irish Sea to keep the lights on because we're part of the all-island single electricity market. You're going to hear about a shortage of medicines. You're going to hear...
I think we avoided that one.
Well, you're going to hear about the shortage of medicines in regards to treatment for cancer and the likes of X-rays, because that requires the use of isotopes. And we're still...
The NHS are actually preparing for a no-deal Brexit.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that they are, but fundamentally, we're not doing right by the NHS and we're not doing right by anybody if we continue down this road where we're taking ourselves out of Euratom, we're taking ourselves further out of supply chains, where pharmaceutical companies can't guarantee the free access of goods and supply chains to actually deliver these things. So people can plan to have them all they want, but actually, if people are held up in Kent, which will come a lorry park, they're not going to be able to actually get that important medicine. So, people call that scaremongering. I prefer to actually just call it the truth and reality. I'm a practical person. The Alliance Party have said from the start that we are going to engage in practical and pragmatic solutions, and that's what we need. And look, there needs to be an informed debate at some stage in the game, and if people don't want to hear the consequences of a no deal, too bad for them, because we are going to ensure that the people of this place are protected, and that we're not going to go into this disaster, as I say, with our eyes wide shut. We are going to continue to do the best we can to protect the people of this place.
Well, we can just hope for some sort of sensible solution to the border from both sides. Now, I know I already sort of briefly mentioned this, but what do you make of the DUP dark money scandal? Is it all above board, or is it going anywhere, or, is it completely not nefarious? And
I think at the minute, obviously, people have a lot of questions. And I'm one of those people. Naomi Long, who was our MP in Westminster, has campaigned very strongly over the years, particularly in Westminster, seeking to change the law around political donations and transparency, which is just an absolute basic staple. People want to know who pays. People want to know who's paying the money for the piper to play the tune. That's a very simple demand. And as I say, that's something that she's campaigned on very strongly, as have the party. And whenever you look at it on the face of it, and people saw that Metro wraparound ad and thought, why is a Northern Ireland party whose prime concern should be about Northern Ireland advertising so strongly in this paper that I think was based in London, isn't it? At an extortionate cost, a very expensive ad to take. That's a huge amount of money, particularly when you've just undergone, an assembly election in Northern Ireland a few months prior, where I'm sure a lot of money would have been used here for the assembly election here. And most political parties at that time are seeking to try and refill the coffers after they've been used. So for a start off, I think people were like, well, for such a Northern Ireland-centric party, where did that come from? Then we saw the issue where the Electoral Commission, was it either today or yesterday, have now come back and said, actually, look, we're not satisfied with vote leave. We're not satisfied with how they conducted themselves, and also an individual, and we're not really sure of how the Be Leave campaign was run as well. My understanding is that they've passed that at the PPS or the police.
So it's Darren Grimes and the representative for Vote Leave, who have both been referred to the police on the grounds that they were using Be Leave and potentially Veterans for Britain to funnel money from Vote Leave to Aggregate IQ as part of a common spending plan.
And, this is the thing. I mean, obviously, because it is a live ongoing investigation now, I'll not really comment on it. But what I will say is that over the course of that referendum, over the course of Brexit, people saw wild claims being made. We all remember the money on the side of the bus. And now we know that actually, I think it was also yesterday, maybe the day before, that a spending watchdog has now come out and said, actually, that claim about the NHS isn't true. That's not the case. And what we saw was really this very dangerous game being played in politics, where people just made essentially what were baseless claims. And the public bought it. And I think now there is a reality setting in that people were sold a pup. And there is now an appetite out there amongst the public to say, look, actually, what did happen? This kind of has a bit of a whiff about it, and I don't like it. And people don't want to believe they've been lied to. That's just a basic human emotion. Nobody wants to think they've been lied to. Nobody wants to think they've been taken for a fool. And it's difficult. It's difficult to come to terms with. If you were one of those voters that voted to leave, that's going to be difficult to swallow because, you know, it's unfair to say that everybody who voted leave just did it out of blind, ideology. There were some people who looked at it and thought, well, actually, on balance, I think I will vote to leave. And that's their call. But those same people who maybe took a look at those figures on the side of the bus are now going, actually, I wouldn't have voted to leave at all had I known that that was just a baseless claim that wasn't the truth. And it's those people who are now querying, along with the rest of us, where did it go wrong? Why was nobody there to challenge that, to query that? Why were people allowed to do this? And, you know, I think that that's going to be a recurrent theme. And, you know, as we were talking about before the interview started, about the issue of Russia, Putin, Trump, you know, it's not just within the UK, you know, it's a huge global issue in terms of, you know, what are people doing? How is my data being used? Where is this information on me going to go? And I think what you're seeing is trust ebbing away in perhaps the democratic process, which is such a dangerous place for us to be because it's the only option that we have. And fundamentally, people in their heart do believe in democracy and they want that to work for them. But there are, you know, sinister currents at play.
I find, and I was listening to a podcast and they were discussing now what we do know about the Trump-Russia links, ties, whatever you want to call it, investigation, what we do know. Because they were discussing how we're all, in a way, waiting for this, aha, so there was this, but without looking back and going, actually, we know quite a lot. And I feel like that's kind of the way it is with the DUP and the dark money scandal in a way. Like, we know that the money came from the Constitutional Research Council, who the only known representative or only given name about it is Richard Cook. We know the DUP Treasurer Gregory Campbell has said to source material that he felt that it wasn't his job to check it out, which is just not true. The electoral law says that it is their responsibility to say it's permissible. So they don't really know where it's come from. The CRC have also funded really like pro-Brexit MPs like Steve Baker, who was I think known as the unofficial ERG whip, who was seen with Katie Hoey and Frank Fields the other day, just straight after they voted to support Conservative amendment that pushed us closer towards a hard Brexit. We know that Richard Cook set up a political consultancy that made no money, never filed any accounts, with the former head of Saudi intelligence, and so someone connected with a gun running case in India. We know that Richard Cook has ties to business he did in Ukraine, taking away supposedly like recycled train tracks that there was never any sort of record for whatsoever, just massive transfers of money. We know that he was accused and found guilty of dumping rubber waste that he labelled as, it was just like cut up tires, he labelled as like a rubber material that was there for recycling or reuse, and then forged documents for the Indian authorities claiming it was something else and it wasn't, through a company that he owned that had nothing to do with chemical assessments. We know that the DUP are inexplicably supporting a hard Brexit, and they got this massive amount of money before they suddenly made their minds up on. It's not like there's no evidence that there might be something foul afoot, and I feel like people are quite reluctant to say that. Even people who maybe believe it, they don't be labelled conspiracy theorists. It's like, no, you're just presenting what we know.
And I think, there's reluctance from people to, comment widely on specific allegations because they don't actually know what has happened yet. The Electoral Commission came out yesterday and said they've passed some information to police. And that's obviously still ongoing, and we don't know what the outcome of that is. And I think nobody wants to maybe prejudice the outcome of what that may be, or speak on live ongoing investigations as such. But like,
so as far as I'm aware, they've conducted an investigation. They've fined someone £6,000, but they can't say who it was because of the donor secrecy laws that James Brokenshire, when he was Secretary of State, chose to extend to just after the referendum.
I know, and, this is one of those things where the UK government and the DUP have questions to answer. It's as simple as that. And, really, a lot of people are querying the likes of, the CRC that you'd mentioned. And I think we all saw the BBC programme that looked at some of those issues in depth. And a lot of people were seriously concerned about what they saw. And as I say, the basic premise of politics is that if you believe in something, you go out and you campaign, vigorously, strongly for it. You shouldn't have anything to hide. Anybody who has stood as a candidate, myself included, has to, fill in various forms. You need to make sure that your spend is within limits. You need to make sure that you're very careful about what you do. Even if it's so much as hiring somebody to do, a graphic for you or whatever, that needs to be all done properly. And to be honest with you, somebody like myself, whenever I stood last year for the first time, I had the fear of God in me about, oh my goodness, am I doing this right? Have I done this wrong? And any right-thinking, decent, morally upstanding person would make sure that they've done the right thing. Because, it's a serious issue, and, to do so fraudulently is a criminal offence. And I think anybody who stands for public office, or anybody who has aspirations to hold public office, certainly needs to respect the law, but more fundamentally needs to respect people. A lot of this just smacks of disrespect for the electorate, and that's something that I think people are finding extremely unpalatable. We don't know what is going to come out of the new evidence that has come forward that's now under investigation. But what we do know is that the public won't stand for unethical behaviour in politics.
Well, I think that's a nice place to leave it.
I could just talk all day about Brexit.
Hate it, but, can't stop talking about it. So as a final question, what are Alliance planning to do to impact the Brexit negotiations in the coming months?
Well, look, we have been at the forefront of the fight for Northern Ireland when it comes to Brexit. Stephen Farry, MLA, who is our deputy leader and Brexit spokesperson, has been at the front of this fight since June 2016, who has been consistent and forthright from the start. In terms of the fact that Northern Ireland voted to remain, we need special arrangements for this place. There's no such thing as a good Brexit, but if we need to do it, we need to have a Brexit that works for Northern Ireland. And since then, we have been, I think, the first party to present a proposal or a position paper, which was our Bridges Not Borders paper. And essentially what that was basically us seeing Northern Ireland as the bridge between the EU and the UK, the GB market that's so important, the East-West piece. And that was us basically saying, look, we have an opportunity here to do something really special. We're being given basically a special deal by the EU. It's not perfect, but look, it works. Let's take it, let's run with it, let's make sure that we develop it into something, strong and workable that protects this place. And it was us who really, pushed forward the concept of Northern Ireland being a bridge. Business got behind us, community got behind us, all sorts of sectors got behind us. And basically what we see is us continuing to push the best option for Northern Ireland. We've been over in Brussels. We have met with Michel Barnier. We are in constant contact with the European Commission. We are in constant contact with the Irish government, with the British government, although I will say our ease of access to the Irish government and also the EU, the European Commission, has been a lot easier sometimes than actually the UK government. And I think in some ways that tells you its own story. You would like to think that you're able to be heard by your own government. And they have given us an audience. But the point is that we feel that we should be consulted a hell of a lot more than what we are at this point in time. We have spoken to the Prime Minister, we have spoken to the Secretary of State, We have continued to lobby Dexu, who's now under Dominic Raab, and said, look, you aren't listening to what we need for Northern Ireland. We will continue to keep up the fight, unapologetically, unashamedly, fighting for the people of Northern Ireland and making sure that we get the best outcome for this place.
Well, it's good to know that somebody is. Sounds like you're putting in a little more work than David Davis.
All of us 4 hours.
Thanks very much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget you can now subscribe to us on Spotify. You can get us on iTunes, on Podbean. Later in the week, we have an interview with Stephen Agnew of the Green Party. So subscribe if you don't want to miss that. Scintillating stuff. It's a great chat.